August 8th, 1944, 7:15 in the morning. La Jaunière, Normandy, France. Sergeant Joe Eakins wiped the sweat from his forehead with a grease-stained rag. The interior of his Sherman Firefly was already stifling despite the early hour. The Norman summer had turned the steel hull into an oven. Through his gun sight, he watched a hedgerow 500 yards distant. Behind that wall of vegetation, something was moving. Something massive. "Steady, lads," Lieutenant James whispered through the intercom. His voice carried a calm that none of them felt. "Whatever comes through that gap, let it get close. Don't fire until I give the word." Eakins had been in Normandy for 2 months. 2 months of terror and triumph. 2 months of watching friends burn alive in their tanks. 2 months of learning that war was nothing like the recruitment posters had promised. He'd seen what German tanks could do to Shermans. The standard Sherman's 75mm gun bounced off Tiger armor like pebbles off a castle wall. British tankers had a grim joke about it. They said the only way a Sherman could kill a Tiger was if the Tiger crew died laughing at them. But Eakins wasn't sitting in a standard Sherman. His tank mounted the 17-pounder. The most powerful anti-tank gun the British had ever built. A weapon that could turn the tables completely. A weapon that German tankers were only beginning to understand. A weapon that was about to change everything. The Firefly crew had rehearsed this moment 100 times. They knew their roles perfectly. Driver Trooper Henry kept the engine at low idle, ready to move at a second's notice. Loader Corporal Thompson had a round already in the breech and another in his hands. Radio operator Trooper Mills monitored the frequencies, listening for any warning of approaching enemy. And Eakins himself sat with his eye pressed to the gun sight, finger resting lightly on the trigger, waiting. What happened in the next 12 seconds would transform Sergeant Eakins from an anonymous gunner into one of the most celebrated tank killers of the war. It would demonstrate a British tactical innovation that German tankers had fatally underestimated. And it would prove that superior German armor could be defeated not just by American industrial might, but by British ingenuity, superior gunnery, and a clever trick that the Wehrmacht never saw coming. The mathematics of tank warfare were about to be rewritten in the Norman countryside, and the Germans, so confident in their heavy Panzers, were about to receive the shock of their lives. To understand what Sergeant Eakins accomplished that August morning, one must first understand the crisis that had gripped British armored forces since the Normandy landings began on June 6, 1944. The invasion had started brilliantly. British and Canadian forces had stormed ashore on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. The carefully rehearsed plans had worked. The Atlantic Wall, which Hitler had boasted would throw the Allies back into the sea, had crumbled in hours. By nightfall on D-Day, the Allies had secured their foothold in France. The beginning of the end for Nazi Germany had commenced. The British Army had come prepared, or so they thought. Years of planning had gone into the invasion. Every unit had trained intensively. Equipment had been checked and rechecked. The men who waited ashore under German fire were the best trained, best equipped British soldiers in history. But then they encountered a problem. A 60-ton problem with 100 millimeters of frontal armor and an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at 2,000 yards. A problem that no amount of training could adequately prepare them for. The Tiger tank. Major John Foley of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry described his first encounter with a Tiger in his post-war memoir. "We came around a corner near Villers-Bocage, and there it sat, massive, angular. It seemed to have grown out of the Norman earth itself. The gun barrel seemed to point directly at my soul. Before we could react, it fired. The Sherman next to us simply ceased to exist. One moment our friends were there. The next, a ball of fire and smoke. The crew never had a chance. I remember the driver's hatch blowing off and a column of flame shooting 30 feet into the air. Then the ammunition started cooking off. We reversed as fast as we could, shells exploding behind us. That Tiger never even moved to pursue. It didn't need to. It just sat there and waited for more victims. The Tiger tank had been designed specifically to dominate any battlefield it entered. Development had begun in 1941, after German forces encountered the Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks on the Eastern Front. These Russian machines had shocked German tankers, who found their weapons ineffective against the new threats. The Germans demanded a tank that would never face that vulnerability. They wanted invincibility. Dr. Ferdinand Porsche and the Henschel Company competed to deliver that invincibility. What emerged from their factories was a 57-ton monster that could destroy any enemy tank at ranges exceeding a mile. The Tiger's 88mm gun was derived from the legendary Flak 18 anti-aircraft weapon. German gunners had discovered during the Spanish Civil War and the French campaign that this anti-aircraft gun was devastatingly effective against tanks. Now that killing power was mounted in a turret and protected by armor so thick that most Allied weapons simply bounced off. The Sherman tank that formed the backbone of British armored forces in Normandy was a fine machine in many respects. It was reliable. A Sherman could run for hundreds of miles without major breakdown. Its air-cooled Continental radial engine was derived from aircraft technology and rarely overheated. It was easy to maintain. Tank crews could perform most repairs, themselves in the field. American factories produced nearly 50,000 of them during the war, more than double the total German tank production of all types combined. But the Sherman had a fatal weakness. Its armor was thin, only 50 millimeters at the front. A German 88mm round could punch through that armor at 2,000 yards and still have enough energy to destroy everything inside. The Sherman's gun was inadequate. The 75mm M3 cannon was a decent weapon against most targets. It could knock out a Panzer Mark IV with reasonable confidence at normal combat ranges. But against a Tiger or a Panther, the Sherman's gun was virtually useless. The rounds simply bounced off. They left barely a scratch on the German armor. The numbers were brutal. British tank crews in Normandy calculated that it took 4 or 5 Shermans to destroy a single Tiger. 3 or 4 of those Shermans would be lost in the process. The mathematics were unsustainable. You couldn't trade 4 tanks and their crews for every enemy tank destroyed. That was a recipe for annihilation. British tankers began calling their vehicles Ronsons after the cigarette lighter. Their advertising slogan was, "Lights first time, every time." The grim humor masked a desperate reality. Corporal William Hewison of the 1st Royal Tank Regiment recorded his feelings in a letter home that was later published in Regimental Histories. Jerry knows his Tigers are kings of the battlefield. He knows we can't touch him frontally, so he just sits there, hull down behind a hedge, and picks us off one by one. It's not war, it's murder. We advance in formation. We spot a Tiger. We open fire. Our rounds bounce off like raindrops. Then he fires once. One of us dies. We fire again. Bounce. He fires again. Another dies. Eventually we get close enough that someone can get around his side or rear. Maybe. If we're lucky. If we're very, very lucky. That's how you kill a Tiger with a Sherman. You sacrifice your friends until you get lucky. I've seen good men die this way. I've seen brave men die. All of them died knowing their weapons were useless. The German tankers knew it too. They knew they had the upper hand. Unteroffizier Karl Wegner of Schwer Panzerabteilung 101, the famous Tiger unit that included Michael Wittmann, wrote in his diary during July 1944. The Tommies send their Shermans against us in waves, wave after wave. It is almost unfair. Their shells bounce off our armor like hailstones. We can destroy them at ranges where they cannot possibly harm us. Some of my comrades feel guilty. It is like shooting fish in a barrel. Our loader counts our kills by making marks on the turret wall. There are many marks now, too many to count easily. Another German tanker, Feldwebel Ernst Barkmann of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, provided equally telling testimony after his capture in August 1944. When I see a Sherman, I feel calm. I know my Panther can kill it easily. I know it cannot kill me unless it gets behind me. So I simply make sure it never gets behind me. I position my tank carefully. I let them come to me. Then I destroy them one by one. It is mechanical, almost boring. Sometimes I feel sorry for those men. They must know they cannot win. Yet they keep coming. This German confidence would prove well-founded for the first 2 months of the Normandy campaign. British and Canadian armored units suffered devastating losses in engagements against German heavy armor. Operation Goodwood in July 1944 lost over 400 tanks in 3 days of fighting. Many fell victim to Tigers and Panthers that seemed impervious to British weapons. But the British were not a people who accepted defeat easily. In the factories of Britain, in the testing grounds of the Royal Armoured Corps, and in the hedgerows of Normandy itself, a solution was being forged. That solution was the Sherman Firefly. And the men who crewed these special tanks would turn the German advantage on its head. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun had been developed in Britain starting in 1941. British intelligence had learned about the new German heavy tanks before they appeared on the battlefield. Unlike many intelligence reports, this one had been taken seriously. Engineers at the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich began designing a weapon specifically to defeat these monsters. The result was a magnificent weapon. The 76.2mm gun fired an armor-piercing round at nearly 3,000 feet per second. That's faster than a rifle bullet. At 500 yards, it could penetrate 140 millimeters of armor. The Tiger's frontal plate was only 100 millimeters thick. For the first time, the British had a weapon that could kill Tigers head-on. The 17-pounder first saw action in North Africa in February 1943. Towed versions proved highly effective against German armor in Tunisia. But a towed gun has limitations. It cannot keep up with advancing tank units. It cannot maneuver on the battlefield. It must be dug in and camouflaged to be effective. What the British needed was that same devastating firepower mounted on a mobile platform. The problem was mounting this massive gun in a tank. The 17-pounder was huge. The barrel alone was over 13 feet long. It had an enormous recoil. When fired, the gun slammed backward with tremendous force. It required a different ammunition handling system. The rounds were longer and heavier than standard tank ammunition. No existing British tank could accommodate it. British designers looked at their options. The Cromwell tank was too small. The Churchill had possibilities, but was primarily an infantry support tank. Then someone had an idea. What about the American Sherman? It was widely available. Its turret ring was large enough to potentially accommodate the 17-pounder. Could the gun be squeezed in? Engineers worked frantically through late 1943 and early 1944. They had to redesign the recoil system to fit the smaller space. They had to relocate ammunition storage. They had to remove the radio from its normal position. The hull gunner's position was eliminated entirely to make room for more ammunition. The loader would have to work in cramped conditions, handling heavy rounds in a space barely large enough for one man. The result was the Sherman Firefly. It looked almost identical to a standard Sherman from certain angles. The same boxy hull, the same rounded turret, the same distinctive American silhouette that had become ubiquitous in every theater of the war. But there were differences if you knew what to look for. The gun barrel extended much further over the hull. The muzzle brake was larger. The turret was slightly modified. And inside, everything was different. The massive 17-pounder gun dominated the turret interior. There was less room for the crew. Every space was used. Every inch was precious. German tankers quickly learned to identify Fireflies by their distinctive long guns. They gave them priority targeting. Kill the Firefly first, then mop up the helpless standard Shermans at leisure. Standing orders went out to every panzer unit in Normandy. The long-barreled Shermans were to be destroyed immediately. They were the only British tanks that posed a threat. This German tactic created an unexpected opportunity, an opportunity that British tank commanders would exploit with deadly effectiveness. By August 1944, Fireflies were being distributed throughout British armored units. Typically, one Firefly would be assigned to each troop of 4 tanks. That single Firefly was the only tank in the troop capable of killing a Tiger. It was precious beyond measure. Its crew knew that German gunners would be searching for them specifically. They knew they wore targets on their backs. So the British got clever. They began thinking like hunters rather than warriors. Tank crews began camouflaging their Fireflies. They painted the extended gun barrel to look shorter. They added fake muzzle brakes partway down the barrel to disguise its true length. Some crews even hung canvas covers over the barrel to obscure its distinctive shape. From a distance, a camouflaged Firefly looked like any other Sherman, just another harmless tank with a harmless gun. The Germans were looking for the long guns. The British gave them short guns that were really long guns in disguise. When a Tiger commander thought he was engaging a harmless standard Sherman, he might actually be facing a 17-pounder that could punch through his armor like paper. The deception was simple but effective. But camouflage was only half of the British trick. The other half was tactical. And this tactical innovation would prove even more deadly than the utter disguise. British tank commanders developed a devastating tactic that exploited both the Firefly's power and its vulnerability. They would hide the Firefly, conceal it completely, place it in a position where it couldn't be seen from the enemy's likely approach. Let the standard Shermans engage first, drawing German attention and fire. Then, when the enemy was focused on the obvious targets, the hidden Firefly would open fire from an unexpected position. One shot, one kill, then relocate before the Germans could respond. This tactic required nerves of steel. The standard Sherman crews were essentially bait. They knew their tanks couldn't harm the enemy Tigers. They knew they were drawing fire that could destroy them in an instant. Yet they held their positions, keeping the Germans occupied, while the Firefly lined up its shot. They were sacrificing themselves to give their comrades a chance. The crews of the Fireflies had an equally difficult task. They had to remain hidden while their friends were being shot at. They had to watch comrades die while waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. They had to make their one shot count because there might not be time for a second. A missed shot meant the enemy knew where you were. A missed shot might mean your friends died for nothing. Lieutenant Colonel Brian Horrocks, commanding 30th Corps in Normandy, described the tactic in his post-war writings. We had learned to fight Tigers by thinking like foxes. We didn't challenge them head-on. We didn't try to match strength with strength. Instead, we used deception and patience. We let the enemy think he was winning. Then we struck from where he least expected. It wasn't glorious warfare. It wasn't the cavalry charge we had trained for. But it worked. And in war, what works is what matters. This combination of disguise and tactical positioning was the trick that would prove so devastating at La Jaunière on August 8, 1944. And the man who would execute it perfectly was Sergeant Joe Ekins of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry. Joseph William Ekins was born on February 18, 1923, in Rushton, Northamptonshire. The town was famous for its boot and shoe factories. Generation after generation of Rushton families had worked the leather, stitched the soles, and packed the finished products for shipment across Britain and the Empire. Ekins's father had worked in the factories. His grandfather had worked in the factories. When young Joe left school at 14, There was never any question about what he would do. Before the war, he had worked at the local shoe factories that gave the town its livelihood. He learned the trade carefully. He developed patience. In shoemaking, haste meant mistakes. A rushed stitch would come apart. A carelessly cut sole would not fit properly. The work demanded precision and calm. These qualities, developed over years of civilian labor, would prove unexpectedly valuable in war. There was nothing in his background to suggest military brilliance. He was an ordinary working-class Englishman who had been conscripted into an extraordinary war. He had no military tradition in his family. He had never fired a weapon before joining the army. He had never even seen a tank until he reported for training. When conscription came in 1942, Eakins reported to the recruiting office in Wellingborough. The army assessed his skills and aptitudes. His excellent eyesight was noted immediately. His steady hands drew favorable comments. But most importantly, his instructors noticed his patience. In the firing tests, Eakins could wait. He could hold his fire when other men would have panicked and shot wildly. In tank warfare, this patience was worth more than medals. A gunner who fired too early missed. A gunner who waited, who tracked the target carefully, who squeezed the trigger at precisely the right moment. That gunner killed. By 1944, Eakins had been trained as a tank gunner with the Northamptonshire Yeomanry. The Yeomanry had a proud tradition dating back to the Napoleonic Wars. Originally a cavalry unit, it had transitioned to armored warfare between the wars. The regimental spirit remained unchanged. Men of Northamptonshire serving together, watching out for each other, fighting for each other. When the Northamptonshire Yeomanry received their first Fireflies in the spring of 1944, Eakins was selected as a gunner for one of them. The selection was not random. His instructors had observed his abilities. They knew he had the combination of eyesight, steadiness, and patience that the new weapon required. The 17-pounder was not a forgiving gun. It required precise aiming. The recoil was tremendous, but in the right hands, it was devastating. Eakins trained intensively with the 17-pounder gun. He learned its quirks, its capabilities, its limitations. He spent hours at the ranges in southern England, perfecting his ability to estimate distance and lead moving targets. He learned to recognize enemy tanks by silhouette. A Tiger, a Panther, a Panzer Mark IV. Each had distinctive shapes. Each required different aiming points. He memorized armor thicknesses. He calculated penetration angles. He became a technical expert in the science of killing tanks. The Sherman Firefly that Eakins crewed was a peculiar machine. From outside, it looked like any other Sherman. The same boxy hull made of welded steel plates. The same rounded turret with its distinctive curved surfaces. The same American silhouette that had become ubiquitous in every theater of the war. The British called it the Ronson. The Americans called it the Tommy Cooker. Neither nickname was affectionate, but inside Eakins's tank, everything was different. The massive 17-pounder gun dominated the turret interior. The breech alone weighed over 500 pounds. When it fired, the breech slammed backward with enough force to kill a man standing behind it. The loader had to be careful. Very careful. One mistake in that cramped space could be fatal. There was less room for the crew. Standard Shermans had 5 crew members. The Firefly had only 4. The hull machine gunner position had been eliminated to make room for ammunition. This meant 1 less gun against infantry, 1 less man to share the work. But it also meant more rounds for the 17-pounder. In a fight against Tigers, those extra rounds mattered more than a machine gun. The ammunition was stored differently, requiring new drills and procedures. The rounds were larger than standard Sherman ammunition, 25 pounds each. Handling them in the confined turret space was exhausting work. The loader had to muscle each round from the storage racks, lift it into the breech, and slam it home. Then he had to immediately grab the next round and prepare for another shot. In combat, A good loader could maintain a rate of fire of 8 rounds per minute. In training, Corporal Thompson had achieved 10. The recoil was tremendous. When the gun fired, the entire tank rocked backward. The noise inside the turret was deafening despite the padded helmets. The smoke and fumes filled the fighting compartment. Loaders sometimes passed out from the cordite fumes during sustained firing. Ventilation in the modified turret was poor. Most significantly, the Firefly had no coaxial machine gun. The standard Sherman mounted a .30 caliber machine gun next to its main cannon, useful for engaging infantry and suppressing enemy positions. The Firefly sacrificed this weapon to accommodate the larger gun breech. The 17-pounder was everything. Against tanks, it was devastating. Against infantry, the Firefly crew would have to rely on their whole machine gun alone. This made the Firefly vulnerable in close-quarter fighting. It needed its companion Shermans to protect it from infantry attack. Lieutenant John James commanded Eakins' troop. A grammar school boy from Surrey, James had joined the yeomanry in 1942 when he was barely 19 years old. He had survived the Italian campaign, fighting at Salerno and Cassino, before being transferred to England for the Normandy invasion. He knew tank warfare intimately. He understood both its technical and human dimensions. Italy had been a brutal education. The narrow valleys and mountainous terrain favored the defender. German tanks and anti-tank guns had dominated the ridgelines. British armor had suffered terribly trying to advance up roads that became death traps. James had seen friends die. He had learned that survival required more than bravery. It required cunning. James had developed his own refinements to the standard British tactics. He positioned his Firefly not just in hiding, but at unexpected angles. Most German tankers expected threats from directly ahead. They positioned their thick frontal armor toward the enemy and felt secure. James would place Eakins' tank to the flank, where a shot could catch enemy armor at its thinnest angles. The Tiger's side armor was only 80 millimeters thick. The Panther's side armor was even thinner, just 45 millimeters. A flank shot from a 17-pounder would penetrate easily. The other tanks in James's troop were standard Shermans. Their 75mm guns were adequate against most German vehicles. Against a Panzer Mark IV, they could give a good account of themselves. But every man in those Shermans knew that if they encountered Tigers, their only hope was Eakins and his 17-pounder. Trooper Eric Campbell crewed one of the standard Shermans. In a 1985 interview for the Imperial War Museum's Oral History Project, he described the relationship between the Shermans and the Firefly. "We knew we were the expendables. Our job was to spot the enemy, engage them, keep them busy. Draw their fire, really. Then Sergeant Eakins would do the killing. It sounds cold when you put it that way. But it wasn't. We trusted each other completely. Joe was the best gunner in the regiment. If there was a Tiger out there, Joe would get it. Our job was to give him the chance." Campbell continued. "There was no resentment. How could there be? We were all in it together. If Joe's Firefly got knocked out, we were all dead anyway. The Tigers would pick us off one by one with nothing to stop them. So we protected Joe. We drew fire for Joe. And Joe killed the things that would have killed us. That was the deal. Everybody understood it. The Germans they would face that August morning belonged to Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 101. This was an elite heavy tank battalion equipped with Tiger tanks. The SS designation indicated they were part of the Waffen-SS, the military arm of the Nazi Party. They were ideologically committed soldiers. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by years of brutal combat against the Soviet Union. More significantly, this unit had included SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, the most famous tank ace of the Second World War. Wittmann was a legend in the German army. He had destroyed over 130 Allied tanks, most of them on the Eastern Front. His exploits had been celebrated in Nazi propaganda. His face had appeared on recruitment posters. He was everything the Reich wanted its soldiers to be: brave, skilled, ruthless, devoted to the cause. On June 13, 1944, at Villers-Bocage, he had single-handedly destroyed a column of British tanks and vehicles. The engagement lasted less than 15 minutes. 14 tanks, 15 personnel carriers, and 2 anti-tank guns fell to his Tiger in a matter of minutes. It was one of the most devastating single-handed actions of the entire war. The British had not forgotten Villers-Bocage. They had studied Wittmann's tactics. They had learned from their defeat. They had analyzed every detail of the engagement: how Wittmann had positioned his tank, how he had selected his targets, how he had used speed and aggression to overwhelm the surprised British column. And they were determined that if they ever caught him again, the outcome would be very different. By early August, Wittmann's unit was depleted, but still dangerous. The relentless Allied bombing, the constant pressure of Operation Goodwood and subsequent British attacks had worn down the German armored forces. Many experienced tank commanders had been killed or wounded. Replacement crews were less skilled. Spare parts were increasingly scarce. Fuel was rationed. But the Tigers themselves remained nearly invulnerable to most Allied weapons. Each Tiger destroyed required extraordinary effort. Each Tiger that survived continued to extract a terrible toll. The mathematics favored the defenders. One Tiger could hold up an entire British armored regiment. One Tiger could destroy a dozen Shermans before being overwhelmed. On August 8th, British and Canadian forces launched Operation Totalize. This was a massive offensive aimed at breaking through the German lines south of Caen. The operation would employ innovative night attacks, heavy bomber support, and concentrated armored thrusts. It was designed to finally crack the German defensive positions that had held firm for 2 months. The plan was ambitious. Armored columns would advance at night, guided by searchlights bounced off clouds and by radio beams. This would achieve surprise and bypass the German anti-tank positions that had proved so deadly in daylight attacks. Then at dawn, heavy bombers would blast open the remaining German defenses. Armored reserves would exploit the gaps and drive deep into German territory. The Northamptonshire Yeomanry advanced as part of the 4th Canadian Armored Division. Their task was to exploit any breakthrough achieved by the initial assault waves. By morning, they had pushed into territory that German forces still contested fiercely. Near the village of La Jaunière, Lieutenant James's troop took up positions overlooking a critical road junction. Intelligence suggested German armor was operating in the area. The hedgerows and orchards provided excellent concealment for both attackers and defenders. This was bocage country. Every field was enclosed by earthen banks, topped with dense vegetation. Every junction was a potential ambush site. James positioned his tanks according to the tactics he had refined over months of fighting. The 3 standard Shermans took hull-down positions behind a low ridge, their turrets just visible above the crest. They covered the main approaches to the junction. Their guns couldn't kill Tigers, but they could spot them, they could report their location, and they could keep them occupied. Ekens's Firefly was placed differently. James had found a sunken lane bordered by high hedges, about 200 yards to the flank. The tank reversed into this natural hide, its gun barrel protruding through a gap in the foliage. From the front, the Firefly was invisible. But Ekens had a clear field of fire across the entire junction. The trap was set. Now they waited. The morning mist had begun to lift when the first German tank appeared. It emerged from an orchard approximately 800 yards distant, moving cautiously along a farm track. The massive vehicle crushed the Norman vegetation beneath its tracks without slowing. Through his binoculars, Lieutenant James immediately identified it as a Tiger, but not just any Tiger. Post-war research by historians, including Brian Reed and Chris Evans, has established that this Tiger bore the tactical number 7. It was commanded by SS Oberscharführer Heinrich Reimers. Reimers was a veteran of the Eastern Front. He had fought at Kursk. He had survived encounters with Soviet T-34s and IS-2s. He was exactly the kind of experienced tank commander who made Tigers so deadly. And moving behind it, partially obscured by the lead tank, was a second Tiger. This one bore the number 019. Some historical accounts suggest that the commander of Tiger 019 was Michael Wittmann himself. This claim remains contested among historians. German records from the period are incomplete, and surviving witnesses gave conflicting accounts. What is certain is that both tanks belonged to Wittmann's elite unit, and both were crewed by experienced veterans. These were not novices. These were killers who knew their business. James watched the Tigers approach. Through his binoculars, he could see every detail: the distinctive overlapping road wheels, the thick angular armor plates, the long 88mm gun that had destroyed so many British tanks. The commander of the lead tank stood in his cupola, scanning the terrain with binoculars of his own, looking for threats, looking for targets. They moved with the confidence of predators who knew they ruled their environment. Their guns traversed slowly, seeking targets. The massive vehicles crushed the Norman hedgerows beneath their tracks as casually as a man walking through tall grass. There was something arrogant about the way they advanced. They expected no serious opposition. Then the lead Tiger spotted the British Shermans on the ridge. At 800 yards, the German commander must have felt completely safe. His Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman at that range easily. He had done it many times before. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate his frontal armor even at point-blank range. He knew this from experience. He had watched Sherman rounds bounce off his tank like toys. The mathematics were entirely in his favor. The Tiger stopped. Its turret began to traverse toward the exposed Shermans. The hydraulic motor whined as the massive gun swung toward its targets. Inside the Tiger, the crew would be going through their drills. Loader, ready. Gunner tracking. Commander calling the target. Everything by the book. This was the moment of maximum danger for James's men. If the German fired first, one of those Shermans would die. The men inside would have no warning. One moment alive, the next dead. That was how tank warfare worked, quick and brutal. But James had planned for this. His standard Shermans opened fire simultaneously. 3 75mm rounds streaked toward the Tiger. None of them could penetrate its armor. They weren't meant to. The shells struck the Tiger's frontal plate and bounced away harmlessly. Flashes of light, clouds of sparks. The armor held as it always did. But the rounds achieved their purpose. They got the German crew's attention. They made noise. They created threat. The Tiger's commander now believed he was engaged with 3 standard Shermans. Easy prey. No threat. Just more victims for his gun. Just more kills to add to his tally. He had seen this situation before. Outmatched British tanks trying futilely to fight back. It always ended the same way. The German radioed his companion, Trooper Campbell, who had monitored German frequencies during the engagement, later recalled fragments of the intercepted transmission. 3 enemy tanks, 12 o'clock, standard Shermans, no Firefly visible, engaging. No Firefly visible. Those words would prove fatally optimistic. Those words contained a fatal assumption. The Germans were looking for the long gun barrel that marked the Firefly. They didn't see it. They assumed it wasn't there. They assumed they were safe. They were wrong. The lead Tiger fired. Its 88mm round screamed across the Norman countryside and struck one of the British Shermans squarely in the turret. The tank exploded. 2 of its crew were killed instantly. The remaining 3 managed to bail out, their uniforms smoking. The second Tiger now moved up alongside its companion. Both German tanks began firing at the remaining Shermans. Their confidence was complete. This was exactly the kind of engagement they excelled at. Outranged, outgunned British tanks trying futilely to fight back. But both German crews had made a critical error. In their focus on the visible targets, they had presented their flanks to the hidden Firefly in the sunken lane. Sergeant Eakins had been watching through his gun sight. He had seen his comrade's tank explode. He had watched his friends die. But he had not fired. He had waited. Just as he had been trained. Just as Lieutenant James had ordered. Now the moment had come. The lead Tiger was broadside to Eakins's position. At 200 yards, he could see every detail of its hull. The road wheels, the distinctive interleaved suspension, the proud black numbers painted on the turret. He could see the commander in his cupola, scanning for more targets, confident that he had the situation under control. Eakins placed his reticle just below the turret ring. The Tiger's side armor was 80 millimeters thick. The 17-pounder could penetrate 140 millimeters at this range. This was going to work. He spoke 2 words into the intercom. "Target. Firing." The Firefly rocked backward as the 17-pounder discharged. The tungsten-cored armor-piercing round covered the 200 yards in less than 1/10 of a second. It struck the Tiger precisely where Eakins had aimed. The round punched through the side armor as if it were cardboard. The effect was catastrophic. The penetrating round smashed through the Tiger's interior, ricocheting off the inside surfaces, fragmenting into white-hot shrapnel that tore through everything in its path. It struck the ammunition storage. The resulting explosion was instantaneous and total. The Tiger's turret lifted from its hull ring on a column of flame. The massive 60-ton vehicle was transformed into a funeral pyre in the time it takes to blink. There were no survivors. The second Tiger's crew had barely registered what had happened when Eakins fired again. Later, analysis would establish that approximately 6 seconds elapsed between shots. 6 seconds to traverse the turret slightly, acquire the new target, aim, and fire. For a tank gunner operating under combat stress, this was extraordinarily fast. The second round struck Tiger 09 in the engine compartment. The Maybach engine exploded. Fire erupted along the tank's hull. Unlike the first Tiger, this one did not explode immediately. The crew had time to attempt escape. The commander's hatch flew open. A figure emerged, his black uniform already burning. He dropped to the ground and rolled in the dirt, trying to extinguish the flames. Behind him, another crew member clambered out, also on fire. The burning tank continued to cook off ammunition for several minutes. Secondary explosions sent debris flying across the Norman field. The smoke rose in a thick black column visible for miles. From the first shot to the destruction of both Tigers, approximately 12 seconds had passed. Lieutenant James's voice came over the radio, formal, but unable to hide its excitement. "Good shooting, Sergeant. Bloody good shooting." The 2 surviving British Shermans emerged from their positions and advanced carefully toward the burning wrecks. The crews were jubilant, but cautious. German infantry might be nearby. More tanks might appear at any moment. What they found when they reached the destruction zone would add to the legend of that morning's engagement. The initial reports from La Jaunière reached British headquarters within the hour. 2 Tiger tanks destroyed in rapid succession by a single Firefly. The ammunition expenditure was remarkable. 2 rounds, 2 kills. A level of gunnery efficiency that seemed almost impossible. But the reports also contained a mystery. The second Tiger, the one designated Walter 9, had been carrying a commander whose body could not be positively identified. The crew members, who had survived the initial hit, had died from their burns before they could be questioned. German dog tags and personal effects had been consumed by the fire. Within days, rumors began circulating through British and German lines alike. Had Michael Wittmann been in one of those Tigers? Had the greatest German tank ace of the war met his end at the hands of a former shoe factory worker from Northamptonshire? The debate continues to this day. Post-war German records confirmed that Wittmann was killed on August 8, 1944, somewhere in the vicinity of the British advance. His body was not recovered at the time. The location and circumstances of his death remained unknown for decades. In 1983, a German war graves organization exhumed remains from a mass grave near Gomisnil, approximately 5 kilometers from La Jaunière. Among the bodies identified was Michael Wittmann. He had been buried with other German soldiers killed in the same general area during Operation Totalize. This discovery did not settle the question of who killed Wittmann. The recovery location was within range of several different engagements. At least 5 different Allied units have credible claims to having destroyed Tigers in that area on August 8th. Some historians favor the theory that Wittmann was killed by a shot from a Canadian tank or a British anti-tank gun rather than by Eakins' Firefly. Others point to the timing, the location, and the description of the engagement as strong evidence that Eakins did indeed kill the German ace. What is beyond dispute is that Sergeant Eakins destroyed 3 Tiger tanks on August 8, 1944. His third kill came later that morning when another Tiger appeared on the same road and met the same fate as the first 2. He also destroyed a Panzer Mark IV that afternoon, 4 German tanks in a single day. This made Eakins the most successful British tank gunner of the Normandy campaign. More importantly, it demonstrated that the Firefly tactics worked. The combination of concealment, deception, and superior firepower could defeat even the mighty Tiger. The Germans drew their own lessons from engagements like La Jaunière. Interrogation reports from August and September 1944 show a dramatic shift in German tanker attitudes. Feldwebel Heinrich Romer, captured near Falaise on August 20th, told British intelligence officers about the changing situation. Before, we were confident against Shermans. The Tiger was invincible against their guns. Now we fear the hidden Firefly. Every Sherman might be carrying the long gun. We can no longer assume safety. The hunter has become the hunted. Unteroffizier Klaus Richter, captured 2 days later, provided even more detailed testimony. Our commanders now order us to identify every enemy tank before engaging. Look for the long gun barrel, they tell us. Destroy the Fireflies first. But the British hide them well. By the time we see the long gun, it is already firing at us. Many of my comrades have died this way. The psychological impact extended beyond individual engagements. German tank crews, who had once advanced confidently against British armor, now hesitated. They scanned hedgerows nervously, looking for hidden killers. This hesitation cost them tactical advantage after tactical advantage. Major Hans von Luch, commanding Panzer Grenadier Regiment 125, wrote in his memoirs about the changing nature of tank warfare in Normandy. The British had found an answer to our Tigers, not through mass production as the Americans did, but through ingenuity. They took an adequate tank and gave it a superb gun. They hid it cleverly. They used their inferior machines as bait. It was elegant and effective. After August, my Panzer commanders told me they feared the Firefly more than any other Allied weapon. The British tactical innovation spread rapidly through Allied forces. American tank destroyers began employing similar ambush tactics. Canadian armored units adopted the hide-and-strike approach that had proven so successful. But beyond tactics, the engagements at La Jaunière demonstrated something more fundamental. They proved that German technological superiority was not insurmountable. British forces had found a way to fight back against the Tiger on equal terms. The statistics from August 1944 tell the story. In June and July, British tank losses against Tigers had averaged 4-1. In August and September, that ratio dropped to less than 2-1. The Firefly and its tactics had changed the equation. Sergeant Eakins survived the war. He returned to Northamptonshire, to his job in the shoe factories, to a quiet life far removed from the killing fields of Normandy. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked about August 8th, he would simply say that he was doing his job. In a rare interview given in 1995, shortly before his death, Eakins reflected on that morning. "I don't know if one of those tanks had Wittmann in it. I've heard the stories. People seem very interested in that question. But it doesn't matter to me who was in those tanks. They were the enemy. They were killing my friends. I stopped them. That's all that counts." Lieutenant James was awarded the Military Cross for his leadership during the engagement. His citation praised his tactical positioning and coolness under fire. After the war, he became a schoolteacher and never returned to military service. The crew members of the destroyed Sherman were recovered and buried in the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery at Ronville. Their names are inscribed on the same stone. William Peters, Thomas Hodgkin. Both were 20 years old. The success at La Jaunière was not an isolated incident. Throughout August and September 1944, Sherman Fireflies extracted an ever-increasing toll on German armor. The weapon that British designers had struggled to create, that production planners had fought to manufacture, that crews had trained so hard to master, was finally delivering on its promise. By the end of the Normandy campaign, British and Canadian Fireflies had destroyed an estimated 300 German tanks. Of these, approximately 40 were confirmed as Tigers. Given that the entire German Tiger force in Normandy numbered fewer than 150 vehicles at any one time, this was a devastating attrition rate. The 17-pounder gun became the standard around which British anti-tank tactics revolved. New tank destroyers mounted the weapon. Self-propelled versions appeared on various chassis. Anti-tank batteries received towed versions that could be dug in and concealed. But it was in the Sherman Firefly that the gun found its most effective platform. The combination of mobility, protection, and firepower gave British commanders a flexible weapon that could engage Tigers with confidence. German countermeasures never succeeded in neutralizing the Firefly threat. Orders went out to German tank crews to identify and destroy Fireflies first. Special tactics were developed, but the British were equally adaptive. Camouflage techniques improved. Positioning became more sophisticated. The deadly game of hide-and-seek continued to favor the hunters. The broader lessons of the Firefly success extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. British forces had demonstrated that superior enemy weapons could be countered through intelligence, innovation, and determination. The Tiger tank was a masterpiece of German engineering. It represented years of development. Its armor was nearly impenetrable to most Allied weapons. Its 88mm gun was devastating. In a straight fight, it should have dominated the battlefield. But war is never a straight fight. The British refused to accept German superiority as permanent or inevitable. They developed a counter-weapon. They refined tactics to maximize its effectiveness. They trained crews to implement those tactics under the most demanding conditions. This pattern would repeat throughout the war. German wonder weapons, from the V-1 flying bomb to the Me-2 jet fighter, would emerge and briefly threaten Allied supremacy. Each time, British and American forces would find countermeasures. The Allies did not win the war by matching German technology. They won by negating it. The men who crewed the Fireflies understood this intuitively. They knew their tanks were not individually superior to Tigers. They knew that, in a fair fight, they might lose. So they made sure the fights were never fair. They used every advantage their weapon and their training gave them. They exploited every German weakness they could identify. Trooper Campbell, interviewed 60 years later, summarized the approach simply. "Jerry built the biggest, toughest tank in the world. We found a way to kill it anyway. That's what British soldiers do. We adapt. We overcome. We win." The German response to the Firefly threat revealed the limits of their own strategic thinking. Rather than developing new tactics to counter the British weapon, they demanded new technology. Thicker armor, bigger guns, heavier tanks. The result was vehicles like the Tiger II, the King Tiger, which weighed nearly 70 tons and was almost impossible to move, maintain, or supply in combat conditions. Meanwhile, the British continued refining their proven approach. More Fireflies were produced, training improved, tactics evolved. By early 1945, British armored units had achieved a level of competence against German heavy armor that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The contrast between approaches reflected fundamental differences in military philosophy. Germany sought technological superiority. Britain sought tactical effectiveness. In the end, tactics proved more important than technology. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group, addressed this issue directly in his post-war analysis. The German made excellent tanks, but he never understood that tanks fight in armies, not as individuals. We learned to fight as combined teams, infantry, artillery, armor, and aircraft all working together. The German relied on the superior machine. We relied on the superior system. The system Montgomery described incorporated Fireflies as its anti-armor specialists. Just as infantry had their snipers and artillery had their counter-battery specialists, British armor had tank killers dedicated to engaging the most dangerous enemy threats. This specialization reflected broader trends in British military thinking. The days of the generalist were ending. Modern warfare demanded experts, soldiers who knew their specific role and executed it with precision. Sergeant Ekins exemplified this expert mentality. He was not a commander. He did not make tactical decisions above his level. But within his sphere, the engagement and destruction of enemy armor, he operated at the highest level of proficiency. His two-shot destruction of 2 Tigers demonstrated what a specialist could achieve when given the right tools and the right opportunity. The German tankers he killed that August morning were also specialists. They had years of experience. They had mastered their complex machines. But their specialization ran in only one direction. They knew how to fight. They did not necessarily know how to adapt when their advantages were countered. This adaptability, or lack thereof, would prove decisive throughout the war. German forces repeatedly achieved early successes through superior weapons and training. But when those advantages were neutralized, they struggled to develop new approaches. The British, starting from positions of disadvantage, proved remarkably adept at finding solutions. The Sherman Firefly remained in British service until 1949. As the EOF War ended and the Cold War began, it was gradually replaced by new tank designs. But the principles that made it effective, powerful guns, clever tactics, superior training, remained central to British armored doctrine. The men who crewed Fireflies went on to varied lives. Some remained in the military, their experience valued as Britain rebuilt its armed forces. Others returned to civilian life, their wartime service becoming a fading memory as years passed. Joe Ekins died in 2012 at the age of 89. He had never sought fame for his wartime exploits. He had never tried to profit from the mystery of whether he killed Michael Whitman. He remained what he had always been, a quiet, modest man who had done extraordinary things when his country needed him. In his hometown of Rushden, a memorial was eventually erected. It honors all the soldiers from Northamptonshire who served in the Second World War. Ekins's name is among them, undistinguished from the thousands of others. But among tank historians, among veterans of armored warfare, among those who study the brutal calculus of combat, Ekins holds a special place. He demonstrated what a well-trained gunner could achieve with the right weapon at the right moment. The broader legacy of the Firefly extends beyond individual achievements. It represents a triumph of engineering improvisation. British designers took an American tank that was inadequate for European combat and transformed it into a Tiger killer. They did this in months, not years. They did it without the vast industrial resources that America possessed. This improvisation reflected the British approach to the war generally. Britain could not match German industrial output or American manufacturing capacity, but it could think creatively. It could adapt quickly. It could find unconventional solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The radar that won the Battle of Britain, the code-breaking that cracked Enigma, the tactics that defeated the U-boats, the weapons that destroyed the dams. All of these reflected the same innovative spirit that produced the Firefly. German prisoners captured in late 1944 repeatedly expressed amazement at British improvisation. Hauptmann Werner Gerhardt, a tank battalion commander captured during Operation Market Garden, told his interrogators about this phenomenon. "We German soldiers expect war to be conducted according to proper procedures. We have regulations for everything. You British seem to make things up as you go along. Yet somehow it works. You produce solutions we never anticipated. The Firefly is a perfect example. You took a mediocre American tank and turned it into our worst nightmare." This assessment contained considerable truth. The Firefly was not an elegant weapon. It was cramped. It had compromises throughout its design. The recoil of the 17-pounder was so powerful that the gun had to be modified repeatedly to prevent damage to the tank itself. The ammunition was difficult to handle in the tight confines of the modified turret, but it worked. Against Tigers, it worked magnificently. And in war, what works matters more than what looks good on paper. The American Army observed British Firefly success with great interest. They had their own solutions to the Tiger problem, including the tank destroyer doctrine and the development of upgunned Sherman variants. But they studied British tactics closely. Many American armored units adopted similar hide-and-strike approaches in the later stages of the war. The cross-pollination of ideas between British and American forces was one of the great strengths of the Western Alliance. Neither nation had all the answers, but together, sharing information, adapting each other's innovations, they developed combined arms tactics that proved unstoppable. The German approach, by contrast, remained rigidly hierarchical. Innovations were slow to spread. Lessons learned in one unit might never reach others. The famous German efficiency masked a bureaucratic inflexibility that hampered rapid adaptation. This contrast helps explain why Germany, despite producing superior individual weapons, lost the technological war. The Tiger was better than the Sherman. The Panther was better than most Allied tanks. German optical equipment was superb. German engineering was precise. But the Allies won anyway. They won because they adapted faster, produced more, and combined their resources more effectively. The Firefly was just one example of this broader pattern. In the hedgerows of Normandy, in those desperate summer months of 1944, British tank crews proved that courage and ingenuity could defeat superior machines. They paid a terrible price. Thousands of British and Canadian tankers died in Normandy, many of them in hopelessly mismatched encounters with German heavy armor. But they persevered. They learned. They adapted. And eventually, they prevailed. Sergeant Joe Eakins, sitting in his hidden Firefly on that August morning, represented everything that made this possible. He had the weapon, he had the training, he had the tactical position. And when the moment came, he had the skill to execute perfectly. 2 shots, 2 Tigers, 12 seconds. The Germans never saw it coming. And that, perhaps, is the ultimate tribute to British tank warfare in the Second World War. Not that they had better weapons, but that they used the weapons they had better than their enemies ever expected. The Tiger remained a formidable opponent until the end of the war. No one who faced one ever took the encounter lightly. But after August 1944, German tankers could no longer assume they were invulnerable. Every hedgerow might hide a Firefly. Every Sherman might be carrying the long gun. The psychological advantage had shifted. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had once said that material factors in war are overestimated. What counts is the morale of the fighting men. In Normandy, British forces proved him both right and wrong. Material factors mattered immensely. Without the 17-pounder gun, British tanks would have remained helpless against Tigers. But morale mattered equally. The crews who waited in their hidden positions, watching their friends die, holding their fire until the perfect moment, displayed a discipline and courage that no machine could provide. The men who drove their standard Shermans forward as bait, knowing they could not harm the Tigers, but drawing their fire anyway, showed a willingness to sacrifice that defined the British soldier. These human factors, combined with technical innovation and tactical creativity, produced victories like La Jaunière. They proved that even in an age of industrialized warfare, individual courage and skill still decided battles. The story of August 8, 1944, endures because it encapsulates so much about the British way of war. A clever trick, a hidden weapon, superior gunnery, the willingness to let the enemy think he was winning right up until the moment of his destruction. The Germans came forward confidently that morning. They saw standard Shermans. They knew their Tigers were invulnerable to those guns. They began the engagement certain of victory. 12 seconds later, both Tigers were burning wrecks, and somewhere in the Norman hedgerows, Sergeant Joe Eakins was already scanning for his next target. That was the British trick. Make the enemy think he's winning. Let him expose himself. Then destroy him before he understands what's happening. The Germans at La Jaunière were stunned. They had every reason to be. They had encountered something they didn't expect, something they couldn't counter, something that turned their greatest advantage into fatal overconfidence. They had encountered the Sherman Firefly. They had encountered British tactics refined through months of bitter fighting. Most importantly, they had encountered Sergeant Joe Eakins of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, a shoe factory worker from Rushden, who happened to be the finest tank gunner in the Allied armies. The Tigers never had a chance. The lesson of La Jaunière echoed across the battlefields of 1944 and beyond. Superior technology alone could not win wars. The Germans had built magnificent tanks. They had trained excellent crews. They had developed sophisticated tactics. But they had not prepared for enemies who refused to play by their rules. The British way of war, shaped by centuries of fighting against larger enemies, emphasized flexibility and cunning over brute force. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the deserts of North Africa, British soldiers had learned that victory came to those who adapted fastest and thought most creatively. Sergeant Joe Eakins returned to Rushden after the war. He went back to the shoe factories. He married, raised a family, and lived a quiet life, far from the killing fields of France. He rarely spoke about what he had done. When neighbors asked about his medals, he would change the subject. But in the archives of the Imperial War Museum, in the records of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry, in the histories of armored warfare, his name endures. 2 shots, 2 Tigers, 12 seconds. The Germans were stunned because they had believed their own propaganda. They had convinced themselves that their Tigers were invincible. They had grown complacent in their superiority. And when a shoe factory worker from Northamptonshire shattered that superiority with 2 perfectly aimed shots, they discovered what the British had known all along. In war, the cleverest fighter usually wins, not the strongest, not the best equipped, the cleverest. Joe Eakins was very clever indeed.